Today we're plunging into, well, an incredibly ambitious framework. I mean, this one aims to unify not just physics, but consciousness and maybe even, ancient wisdom.
Yeah, it's quite something. We're talking about the primordial superfluid substrate theory, or PSUMOT for short.
PSUMOT. Right. And you've brought us a really fascinating stack of sources today, stuff from the bleeding edge of quantum physics, cybernetics, even Jungian psychology.
And they all seem to be pointing towards what its proponents argue is, well, a singular underlying reality. It's a lot to get your head around, definitely.
But the implications are just huge.
Indeed. And our mission today really is to unpack this all-encompassing theory, and specifically to ask that big question, why isn't modern science really embracing this? Such a potentially unifying model, one that claims to simplify and explain so much of what we currently just call mysteries.
Yeah, why the hesitation? Is it like a fear of upending established work, decades of research suddenly needing a total rethink?
That's certainly part of the discussion we need to have. We'll explore how PSEO tries to explain everything from dark matter and dark energy all the way to the very nature of human belief, perception,
Wow.
and even delves into what might happen in those profound moments between birth and death. It's a bold framework, no doubt, and our sources present a really compelling, if controversial narrative.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We'll start by looking at PSEO, well, frankly, bold claims about the universe's fundamental nature, how it proposes to solve some of science's biggest puzzles.
Right. The foundations first.
Then we'll pivot right into that crucial question. Why the scientific resistance? We need to explore the maybe deeply ingrained reasons for skepticism, the structural hurdles within science itself.
Absolutely. The why not part.
After that, we'll look into how PSU's proponents actually address these critiques.
Yeah.
What they suggest is the path forward, to convince people.
The rebuttal.
And from there, we connect the cosmic to the personal, exploring how this superfluid seems to touch every aspect of our experience, our individual minds, consciousness, even society.
And ultimately, yeah, that great mystery of what lies beyond life.
Okay, get ready, because this theory connects dots you might not expect.
The revolutionary claims of PSU Mote, a unifying vision.
So, okay, to understand why this theory faces resistance, we first need to grasp the sheer scope of what PS Moot is actually proposing. This isn't just another physics model, is it? It sounds much bigger.
Oh, much bigger. It's presented as a truly grand synthesis, suggesting a single underlying reality for, well, everything.
Everything.
That's the claim. What's fascinating here is that PSUMO posits the universe is fundamentally composed of a single primordial quantum superfluid substrate. They call it the PSS.
The ESS.
And this isn't just some exotic substance floating around in space. It's presented as the unitary substrate of reality itself.
So the fabric of reality is this PSS.
Kind of. Think of it as a hyperdense, undifferentiated medium, where what we perceive as individual particles, electrons, quarks, and their properties, they're actually subsumed into a collective, fluid-like behavior.
That's a massive shift from how we normally think about it, right? Like particles in mostly empty space.
Exactly. This is a significant departure. It suggests the universe is one vast, interconnected, energetic ocean, maybe, rather than, a scattering of islands in emptiness.
So it's not just a backdrop, but an active, unified medium that is everything. That's quite a foundational reimagining.
It is, and from this foundational premise, PSUMO offers some truly ambitious explanations for some of cosmology's biggest mysteries.
Like dark matter and dark energy.
Precisely. First, it claims to unify them. The theory identifies this PSS, this superfluid substrate, as what we gravitationally measure as dark matter.
Ah, okay, so no new particles needed.
Right. It removes the need for these undiscovered non-baryonic particles that's, particles not made of regular stuff like protons and neutrons that the standard model, Lambda CDM, currently hypothesizes.
So phenomena like galaxy rotation curves,
Yeah.
gravitational lensing,
Yeah.
the things we usually attribute to dark matter.
Are explained within PSUMO as simply bulk gravitational effects of this pervasive PSS. The medium itself has the gravitational effect we call dark matter.
Okay, that feels elegant. Simpler in a way. It doesn't add new unknowns. It redefines what's there.
It aims for that, yeah. And what about dark energy? That mysterious force causing the universe's accelerating expansion.
How does PSU handle that?
Well, it proposes that this acceleration isn't due to some separate dark energy or a static cosmological constant. Instead, it's an emergent effect of what they call cosmic pressure within this constrained superfluid.
Cosmic pressure. What does that mean?
Imagine the superfluid has this immense creative potential, like a fundamental urge to manifest reality. But the rate at which space-time itself can expand to accommodate these new manifestations is finite.
So the superfluid wants to create more faster than space can expand.
Kind of like that. It's like the superfluid is plugged up, primed to manifest more, but the universe isn't unfurling fast enough to allow it. This mismatch, this tension, creates an outward push on the fabric of space-time.
And that's what we observe as dark energy, the accelerating expansion.
That's the proposal. It offers a dynamic physical cause for acceleration, moving beyond just a static, unexplained number in our equations. And it even claims to provide a solution to the coincidence problem.
It is.
Why the acceleration started relatively recently, cosmically speaking, around 5 billion years ago. PSUOT suggests this is when the universe's overall density dropped below a critical point, allowing this underlying pressure to dominate.
Okay, so it's not just a placeholder number, but a dynamic mechanism rooted in the superfluid's nature. That is a powerful explanatory advantage if it holds up. It offers a coherent story.
It does. But PSUOT goes even further. It challenges the very foundations of physics, like general relativity and the standard model of particle physics.
Whoa. How does it manage that? That's taking on the giants.
It's pretty radical, yeah. PSUOT asserts that gravity isn't a fundamental force at all.
Not fundamental.
Nope, but rather an emergent effect of the PSS's fluid dynamics, specifically its pressure and flow gradients.
So gravity is like ripples or currents in this superfluid.
That's the idea, and this helps to explain the hierarchy problem.
The huge difference in strength between gravity and the other forces.
Exactly. Why is gravity so vastly weaker than electromagnetism or the nuclear forces? If gravity is just a secondary bulk effect of the superfluid, rather than a primary force acting between discrete particles, its relative weakness becomes, well, less puzzling.
Gravity as a large-scale fluid behavior, not a fundamental interaction. That's a huge reimagining. And you mentioned it subsumes general relativity. What does that mean practically? Like Einstein was wrong.
Not exactly wrong, but maybe incomplete or describing something at a higher level. When PSUOT says it subsumes general relativity, it means it views Einstein's field equations not as the ultimate truth about gravity's fundamental nature, but as an incredibly accurate effective field theory.
An effective theory, meaning it works well in its domain but doesn't capture the deepest layer.
Precisely. It suggests Einstein's equations are exceptionally good at describing gravitational phenomena on large scales, which they see as the behavior of the PSS fluid on those scales, but they describe the symptoms or the patterns of a deeper reality, the PSS fluid dynamics, rather than the ultimate cause itself.
So the curvature of spacetime in GR, what's that in the PSUMO?
It's reinterpreted as simply a mathematical description of the pressure and density gradients within the PSS. Things like frame dragging become vortices in the fluid, and gravitational waves are seen as pressure waves propagating through the fluid.
Wow, okay, so it keeps GR's predictive power, but gives it a different physical basis.
That's the goal. And this thinking aligns with something called superfluid vacuum theory, or SVT, where core concepts we take for granted, like Lorentz symmetry, a cornerstone of special relativity, are actually seen as emergent properties of low energy fluctuations within a deeper, non-relativistic condensate. SVT provides a potential physical basis for space-time itself, arising from this substrate.
So Einstein's genius isn't thrown out, but maybe recontextualized as describing the behavior of this more fundamental fluid reality. Okay, what about the standard model then? The particles, electrons, quarks, are they also emergent?
Yes, same principle. Standard model particles aren't seen as fundamental entities in themselves either. Instead, they're described as specific stable wave patterns that form within the PSS.
Class wave pattern.
Yeah, think of an analogy with string theory, where particles are sometimes described as musical notes on a tiny vibrating string.
Right, different vibrations of different particles.
Exactly. But with PSUOT, the cosmic superfluid provides the actual instrument upon which these notes are played. The stable wave patterns are the particles. So PSUOT offers a potential physical what and where for string theory's how, proposing a single unifying source for all matter arising from these patterns in the superfluid.
That's a truly unifying vision for physics.
Okay.
But it gets even more conceptually challenging, doesn't it? With the idea of the universe having a memory. Morphic resonance.
It does. This is where it steps beyond just physics as we know it. The framework introduces morphic resonance as a potential physical memory effect within the PSS.
A memory. How would that work?
The core idea is If the PSS has memory, then the energy needed to form a specific wave pattern, say, a particular particle or structure, should decrease slightly with each subsequent formation of that same pattern.
Like it gets easier to make something the more often it's been made before.
Exactly. It's like the universe develops habits or learns preferred configurations. This isn't just about physics anymore. It ties into ideas of cosmic scale information feedback and learning systems. Past wave patterns actually reinforce the probability of their future emergence.
A universe that learns and builds upon its past states. That's incredibly poetic.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
well, it starts to sound almost divine. Which brings us to that final, most ambitious claim you mentioned.
Right. PSU Modi isn't presented just as physics. It's aiming for a grand synthesis that bridges science and, yes, even divinity.
How so?
Well, the framework explicitly tries to integrate fields like cybernetics, societal control, and even theological concepts. It suggests that Isaac Newton's intuition about a universal ether and the theological concept of God's omnipresence might find physical expression in the cosmic superfluid as the divine substrate.
So the PSS is the medium of divine presence.
That's the interpretation offered.
Yeah.
And the biblical concept of the Logos, the creative word of God, is described as the information waves that give form to this substrate. These waves represent the ultimate act of observer shaping, we'll get more to that later, by a kind of divine consciousness. The ultimate goal here is really to dissolve what they see as a false dichotomy between science and religion.
Showing them as complementary paths to understanding the same underlying reality.
Exactly. It's a truly all-encompassing vision, trying to connect the physical universe with spiritual concepts in a, well, they hope, rigorous way.
The obstacle course. Why modern science resists synthesis.
Okay, so if PSU Mode offers such a powerful, seemingly unifying vision, it claims to simplify explanations for dark matter, dark energy, gravity, particles, maybe even connect to consciousness. Why isn't it being universally lauded? Why isn't it being adopted by mainstream science? Why the strong resistance, even just to, entertaining the idea?
Right. It seems like a model that explains the most in the simplest way should be, well, celebrated, shouldn't it? Isn't that sort of the goal of science, finding that elegant simplicity?
Yeah, Occam's razor and all that. So what's the holdup?
Well, this raises really important questions about the nature of scientific progress itself. And it goes right to the heart of your observation. While PSU mode aims to offer, as its proponents say, a more complete and physically intuitive explanation,
Hmm.
conventional science sees its current formulation as lacking several key things. Primarily, rigorous mathematical formalism, clear falsifiable predictions, though we'll revisit that, and direct empirical evidence. Enough evidence, anyway, to supersede the existing highly successful models like lambda CDM and general relativity.
So it's about proof, hard proof.
Exactly. The scientific establishment, quite rightly, demands incredibly stringent proof, especially when you're challenging foundational theories.
It's a high bar, then. The rigorous demands of proof seem to be the primary barrier, especially for something this revolutionary.
They are, definitely. The main critique, the one you hear most often, is indeed the lack of that rigorous mathematical formalism. And PSUMO proponents, to be fair, readily admit that developing this math is the next great challenge for the theory.
So they know it's a gap.
Oh, yeah. For instance, one review mentioned in our sources by Dr. Reed essentially dismissed core principles of PSUMO as just metaphor, precisely because it lacked this perceived mathematical rigor.
Ouch. Metaphor, not math.
Right. And you have to compare that to the standard model and general relativity. These theories have decades of incredibly precise experimental verification behind them. Think about the accuracy needed for GPS systems. That relies on GR, or particle accelerator results confirming things like the Higgs boson.
Yeah, those models work incredibly well for what they describe.
They do. So any new theory, no matter how elegant or appealing its narrative is, must meet incredibly high standards to either integrate with or replace them. Science is, and probably should be, conservative when it comes to discarding models that work so well, even if they have known gaps or mysteries.
That makes perfect sense from a methodological standpoint. You build on what works, demand evidence, but you also suggested there's maybe a cultural element to this resistance, almost a, what'd you call it, a case strategist mentality in science.
Yeah, that's a term used in the sources to describe a certain aspect of the scientific culture. Modern science, as these sources describe it, operates in a very fragmented, reductionist culture.
Meaning everyone stays in their own little box.
Pretty much. The scientific establishment is characterized as being full of hyper-specialized case strategists. Each expert is digging deeper and deeper into their own narrow burrow, often blind to the larger landscape connecting them all.
So specialization itself becomes a barrier to seeing the big picture.
The sources argue yes. This methodology, ironically, becomes a kind of rejection of synthesis. Think about it. A particle physicist might, laugh at the notion of a universal ether.
Because it sounds old-fashioned.
Right. While simultaneously measuring its gravitational effects and meticulously labeling them dark matter. Or a neuroscientist might dismiss consciousness as just, an epiphenomenon side effect of brain activity. While an AI engineer is building tools like AlphaVolve that use a simulation of consciousness, or at least learning, to make genuinely novel mathematical discoveries, there's a disconnect.
It's like that analogy you used, taking apart the radio, labeling all the parts, but missing where Bing Crosby's voice comes from.
Exactly. The system is more than the sum of its parts. But hyperspecialization often misses that larger, interconnected picture. And that makes it inherently difficult for unifying theories like PSUMOT to gain traction. People are focused on the trees, not the forest.
That's a striking point. The very structure of science might hinder these kinds of breakthroughs. And this resistance also has history, right? You mentioned the dismissal of the ether earlier. PSUMO brings that up specifically.
It does, and it's a crucial point for their argument about scientific resistance. The dismissal of any kind of universal medium has a significant historical root. The Michelson-Morley experiment back in 1887.
The one that tried to detect the ether wind?
That's the one. It was designed to detect the relative motion of the Earth through this supposed luminiferous ether. And famously, it yielded a null result. No wind detected.
Which was seen as disproving the ether.
Right. But P.S. Morado argues this is a category error, a fundamental misinterpretation. The null result didn't disprove the existence of a universal medium, they argue. It only falsified a specific flawed model of that medium.
What was the flawed model?
A static, luminiferous, absolute reference frame kind of ether. A very simplistic picture. The scientific establishment, unable to reconcile the null result with that simplistic model, basically threw the baby out with the bathwater. They discarded the entire concept of a medium.
Creating what P.S. Moat calls a conceptual vacuum.
Exactly. A vacuum that has persisted for over a century. So the argument goes, it wasn't the idea of a medium that was disproven, but a particular incorrect understanding of it.
And science just moved on, without revisiting the core concept. Even when new evidence pops up like dark matter and dark energy, which PSU Moklitz claims are manifestations of an underlying medium, that seems like a potentially huge historical blind spot.
That's the PSUMO perspective, yes. This historical misinterpretation highlights what they see as an inherent resistance within science to revisiting foundational assumptions, even when new evidence seems to point back towards a similar need. It's a reluctance to entertain anything that might upend established paradigms.
And that reluctance is deeply ingrained.
Apparently so. This sounds like a broader pattern of just resistance to innovation and paradigm shifts in science generally.
Is that common? Or is PSUMO facing something unusual here?
Oh, it's historically very common. Major innovations almost always face fierce resistance. Think about Einstein's theory of relativity. It took something like 30 years for widespread acceptance, despite its revolutionary power.
30 years. Wow.
Yeah. Or remember the president of the Royal Society back in 1900 famously declared that heavier-than-air flight was impossible, and X-rays were basically a hoax.
Just before they became reality.
Right. This reluctance to accept anything new seems deeply ingrained, especially within the academic structure. As one source puts it, maybe a bit cynically, if you propose a totally novel PhD thesis, your supervisor might just say, look, I don't know anything about that. Why don't you do a thesis on something I know?
Which limits the scope of research dramatically.
It squeezes our range of options, as the source says. It limits potential avenues for discovery. The whole process of scientific validation, peer review, funding, publication often favors more of the same, incremental advances within existing frameworks. It takes overwhelming, undeniable evidence to force a major paradigm shift.
And even then, it can be a slow, maybe even generational process for the old ideas to fade away.
Exactly. So PSUMO is pushing against not just specific scientific critiques, but also potentially this cultural inertia and historical baggage.
Addressing the doubters, PSUMO's rebuttals, and future path.
Okay, so PSUMOT faces this kind of entrenched resistance, lack of math, challenging successful models, historical bias, cultural inertia. How does it respond? How do its proponents try to, counter these critiques and maybe help doubters see it differently?
Well, they don't just dismiss the critiques, they seem to engage with them, particularly the crucial point about falsifiability. As we know, that's a cornerstone of the scientific method. A theory has to be testable, potentially provable wrong.
Right. Is BSEM mode falsifiable? Especially the more out there parts, like morphic resonance.
Well, they acknowledge that morphic resonance is the most speculative part of the framework, but crucially, they assert it is not inherently unfalsifiable.
Okay, so they're not just making grand claims without suggesting ways to test them. That's important. That directly counters a major scientific criticism.
Exactly. They're trying to meet science on its own terms. For morphic resonance, they propose a specific, testable prediction.
What is it? How could you possibly test for a universal memory?
It involves particle accelerators. The prediction is this. If you repeatedly create and annihilate exotic, short-lived particles, the same type of particle, again and again under identical conditions,
Uh-huh.
a morphic resonance model would predict that the energy cost to produce the, say, n plus fernth particle might actually be fractionally lower than the energy cost to produce the nth particle.
Wait, so it gets easier to make the particle the more times you've made it? Like the universe is learning how to do it more efficiently?
That's the implication of the morphic resonance idea, yes. Now, the standard model, conversely, assumes that such properties, like the energy cost to create a particle, would remain absolutely constant for each identical creation.
So measuring that tiny energy difference could potentially distinguish PSUAA from the standard model.
It provides a concrete, albeit extraordinarily precise and challenging experimental pathway. If that fractional decrease in energy costs were ever detected, it would be revolutionary. It would fundamentally shake particle physics.
That is an audacious prediction. It might require precision beyond what we currently have, but it's a clear, testable hypothesis.
Okay. What about the other big critique? The lack of mathematical rigor. That seemed like a major sticking point.
Right, and here again, they acknowledge the issue. PSUL-OD proponents state clearly that developing rigorous mathematical formalism is indeed the next great challenge.
So it's not a dismissal of the critique, but an acceptance of the necessary next step for it to gain mainstream acceptance.
Exactly. They see it as essential. The stated aim is to translate this powerful narrative into the unforgiving language of mathematics and observation.
But crucially, they have to do that without messing up what current models predict correctly, right? Like the cosmic microwave background.
Precisely. They need to do it without spoiling the precise predictions for the CMB and large-scale structure that the standard lambda CDM model makes so successfully. That's, as the sources put it, a very fine needle to thread.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly difficult. You need to replicate all the current successes and explain the gaps and make new predictions. It requires immense theoretical work. They need to show their math can integrate with and extend existing frameworks, not just replace them wholesale immediately.
It sounds like they're committed to meeting science on its own terms then, while still emphasizing the overall explanatory power of their framework. It's a delicate balance. Respect what works, but offer something deeper.
They certainly seem to be trying. Despite the current challenges with the math, PSMO constantly highlights its powerful explanatory advantages. It offers what proponents call a physically intuitive, unified mechanism for the greatest mysteries of cosmology,
Reframing them not as separate problems needing separate fixes.
but as interconnected facets of a single underlying reality. For instance, by identifying dark matter as the PSS itself and dark energy as its cosmic pressure, PSU-MOTE addresses the two major hypothetical components of the standard model without resorting to undiscovered particles or an unexplained cosmological constant. It offers a coherent, single-source narrative.
Which simpler, more piecemeal models struggle to provide. That narrative power is appealing, even if the math isn't fully there yet.
It is, and it's not just about pushing the theory's strengths. They also seem quite transparent about its own recognized weaknesses. That self-awareness is crucial for any scientific endeavor, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What weaknesses do they acknowledge?
Well, one major hurdle they identify themselves is the synchronization problem.
Synchronization.
Yeah. If galactic halos are regions where the PSS tipped into a superfluid state, how did a critical mass of them all do that in a relatively coordinated way across the vastness of the universe? How did they synchronize?
Ah, okay. The fair question about the timing and coordination.
Right. And this transparency about acknowledged challenges alongside proposals for rigorous testing, like the particle accelerator experiment, is really key to building credibility among a skeptical scientific community. It shows they are engaged in genuine scientific inquiry, not just, hand waving or philosophical speculation.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting that the theory also seems to point towards emerging technologies like AI as maybe a way to explore its own principles. Especially this idea of the universe having a memory, the morphic resonance part.
Yes, it connects directly back to that. There's this AI tool called AlphaVolve, developed by DeepMind. It discovers genuinely novel algorithms in mathematics, things humans hadn't found, like a more efficient way to do matrix multiplication.
Right, I've heard of that. It's pretty amazing.
It is, and it learns how to look, how to find solutions, which is described in this context as a higher order form of consciousness or learning.
So how does that relate to PSUMT?
Well, in PSU mote terms, AlphaVolve could be seen as reverse engineering the dynamics of morphic resonance for a specific task. It's discovering optimal patterns, optimal algorithms within a possibility space.
Like finding the most efficient wave patterns for computation.
Sort of, yeah. It suggests that the universe isn't just potentially programmable, but that we are actually developing tools like AI to program it with intent, or at least to discover its inherent optimal patterns. This offers a potential pathway to explore the principles by which stable, efficient wave patterns can be found within the superfluid.
Which could, in turn, tell us something about how reality itself is structured and how it might learn or evolve more efficiently over time.
That's the fascinating implication, linking cutting-edge AI back to these fundamental questions about the universe's nature.
The superfluid and the inner cosmos, belief, perception, and consciousness.
Okay, now let's really connect the dots.
Okay.
How does this quantum superfluid, this PSS, this fundamental substrate of reality, how does it possibly reach into something as seemingly intangible, as personal, as human belief, perception, and consciousness itself? This feels like where PSUMON takes a truly profound turn.
It really is where the theory pushes the boundaries furthest, I think. Because Piaget proposes that consciousness isn't just an emergent property of the brain, a mere byproduct of complex neural activity.
Which is the standard view, mostly.
Right. Instead, it suggests consciousness is deeply intertwined with this universal superfluid. The core idea proposed is that proto-consciousness might be fundamental.
Proto-consciousness, meaning?
Meaning, a basic form of awareness or potential for experience might be an inherent primary property of the universal superfluid itself, not something that arises only with complex biology.
Wow. Okay, so consciousness isn't something the brain creates.
This model radically reframes the brain, not as a generator but a receiver. It suggests the brain functions more like a biological transceiver.
Transceiver, like a radio.
Exactly. Tuning into a specific bandwidth of a much larger, perhaps universal conscious field. The brain filters and processes this field, giving rise to our specific individual experience of consciousness.
So our brains aren't making consciousness from scratch, but acting as antennas, picking up signals from a universal field. That completely flips our usual understanding of mind on its head. It suggests we're more like conduits, not isolated creators.
Precisely. And this leads directly to another key concept in PSU mode, observer shaping.
Observer shaping, what's that?
It's the idea that consciousness, through this receiving mechanism of the brain, actively interacts with what PSU calls a field of pure potential, essentially, the undifferentiated superfluid before it takes definite form.
Interacts how?
By shaping it. The reality that emerges from this interaction isn't seen as fixed or purely objective, out there independent of us. Instead, it's described as being uniquely shaped by the observer's own deepest beliefs, memories, and archetypal structures.
So my internal state influences the reality I perceive.
It's proposed as a dynamic co-creation, a personalized reality that's generated in real time through this interaction between individual consciousness and the universal potential field.
That sounds an awful lot like the quantum observer effect, doesn't it? Where the act of observation seems to collapse possibilities into a definite state.
It's presented as directly analogous. Think of how quantum physics describes particles like electrons existing in a superposition of all possible states, until an observation or measurement causes a collapse into a single definite state.
Right.
PSU Mu views this collapse as a form of observer shaping. Our consciousness, acting as the observer, gives definite form to what they call information waves within the superfluid potential.
Can you give an analogy for that? It's pretty abstract.
Sure. A good metaphor comes from Edwin Land's experiments with color perception, using white light and prisms. The prism, which acts like the observer in this analogy, doesn't create the colors.
No, the colors are potentials within the white light.
Exactly. The prism collapses the potential of the white light into a definite spectrum of observable realities, the rainbow. PSUOT suggests our individual consciousness acts like that prism, filtering and shaping the universal potential of the PSS into our specific perceived reality. This makes reality fundamentally subjective, at least in terms of how it's experienced.
Okay, this implies our internal world, our thoughts, beliefs, memories, plays a much more active role in creating our reality than we might typically imagine.
A fundamentally active role, yes.
And this connects directly to ideas from fields like psychocybernetics, doesn't it? The work of Maxwell Maltz on self-image and imagination, our internal programming.
It aligns beautifully, yes. Maltz's psychocybernetics framework really resonates here. He found that our self-image, this mental blueprint we hold of ourselves, formed from past experiences, beliefs, successes, failures, memories, profoundly shapes our reality.
How so?
It dictates, as Maltz put it, what you can and cannot accomplish, what is difficult or easy for you, even how others respond to you. This self-image acts like a thermostat for what he called our automatic success mechanism, essentially. Our brain and nervous system setting the limits and regulating our output.
So our beliefs about ourselves literally control our capabilities.
To a large extent, yes. And crucially, Maltz made the startling discovery that the nervous system cannot tell the difference between an imagined experience and a real one.
Cannot tell the difference.
Nope. If you vividly imagine something succeeding at a task or failing miserably, your nervous system reacts as if it were actually happening. You get corresponding physical and emotional responses.
Which means?
It means our internal world is continuously, in a sense, hallucinating or generating its own subjective reality. The line between what's real out there and what's generated internally becomes very fluid in our personal experience. Maltz even saw the essence of humans as something extra-physical, the kind of life force animating this biological servo mechanism, a force that gets consumed during adaptation to stress.
So what we believe about ourselves, what we vividly imagine, isn't just internal chatter. In the PSMOD view, it's actively shaping our interaction with the superfluid and therefore shaping the reality we experience.
That's the implication. Your internal state is part of the observer-shaping process.
This also brings Carl Jung's ideas into play, right? Particularly the collective unconscious. That resonates strongly with the PSS, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Jung described the collective unconscious as this deep, inherited layer of the psyche. He called it an omnipresent, unchanging substrate of the psyche, containing archetypes that were present from the beginning.
Omnipresent, unchanging substrate. That sounds very much like the description of the PSS.
It resonates incredibly strongly, doesn't it? PSUMO views Jung's collective unconscious as potentially the psychological manifestation or correlate of the physical PSS, the universal basis of reality.
And the archetypes, those universal patterns Jung talked about, the hero, the mother, the shadow.
Archetypes, which Jung saw as constant autonomous factors and unconscious organizers of our ideas that appear across cultures and history. These could be seen in PSU terms as persistent formative wave patterns within this collective psychic substrate or within the PSS itself.
Like fundamental information patterns embedded in the universe.
Perhaps. Think about the numinous quality Jung described when encountering archetypal material, that feeling that it forces itself upon consciousness, feels immemorially strange and unknown, and yet we seem to have known them from everlasting.
Yeah, that sense of deep familiarity with something ancient.
PSUMO might interpret that feeling as the individual information wave of your consciousness, encountering these ancient, powerful, universal information patterns encoded within the PSS. And Jung himself was open to this kind of connection. He explicitly stated, psyche cannot be totally different from matter. Psyche and matter exist in one and the same world, and each partakes of the other.
That's a direct bridge between the inner world and the outer cosmos, suggested by Jung himself. Our deepest psychological patterns reflecting universal information waves. Amazing. But beyond the purely psychological, there's also a biological aspect to this memory and shaping, isn't there? Through epigenetics.
Yes, the sources bring this in too. They highlight how significant memories, especially those with a strong emotional charge, maybe traumatic ones or crucial survival-related ones, can trigger epigenetic changes.
Epigenetics. That's changes in how genes are expressed, not changes to the DNA sequence itself, right?
Exactly. Things like DNA methylation or histone modification in the relevant neural circuits. These changes then act like a permanent, stable blueprint for that memory, physically marked onto the DNA.
So the memory gets hardwired, in a sense.
In a very real sense, when new cells, like neurons, are formed later, they read this epigenetically modified DNA blueprint to perfectly replicate the structure and synaptic connections associated with that memory. So it grounds the idea that memories, especially powerful ones, physically alter your biological blueprint.
And this can even cross generations.
The model extends to transgenerational trauma, yes. There's growing evidence that these epigenetic markers can sometimes be passed down through the germline sperm and egg cells.
Meaning a parent's trauma could leave an epigenetic mark that influences their child's biology and potentially their behavior or predispositions.
That's the controversial but increasingly studied implication. It means a memory, or at least its biological echo, could be transmitted across generations. So our past literally shapes our biological blueprint.
And that blueprint, in turn, influences the observer shaping of our reality via our consciousness and nervous system.
It becomes a profound feedback loop, connecting environment, experience, biology, and perception across time.
Societal implications, the engineered reality.
Wow. It's really striking how this theory extends beyond the individual mind, beyond biology, right into society itself. You mentioned earlier this feeling of a profound dissonance or a baffling disconnect in how mainstream science, or maybe even society as a whole, understands itself. How does the superfluid framework, and maybe specifically cybernetics, help explain this, and things like the poisoning of minds or the wearing layer of resistance we sometimes feel in society?
Yeah, this moves the lens out from the individual to the collective, raising important questions about control, communication, and the shaping of collective consciousness. The work of Norbert Wiener, who basically founded cybernetics, and Stafford Beer, who developed it further, is key here. They viewed the universe not just as a substance, but as a complex, self-regulating system.
A system based on feedback loops.
Exactly. In this view, even the laws of physics could be seen as the fundamental homeostatic feedback mechanisms of the superfluid, the rules that maintain its equilibrium. But this cybernetic framework also reveals how societal systems can be analyzed, understood, and potentially engineered, often, the sources suggest, to our detriment. Wiener himself studied messages as a means of controlling machinery and society, focusing explicitly on communication and control, and how systems maintain stability through feedback.
So the universe itself, from the smallest scales to the largest, is seen as a self-regulating system. And human society is just another layer of that.
Yeah, that's the perspective. Stafford Beer's concept of a viable system model, VSM, describes the necessary architecture, the essential components and connections for any autonomous surviving entity.
Any entity, like what?
Everything from atoms to galaxies, cells to organisms, companies to nations. They can all be potentially analyzed as viable systems instantiated within this larger superfluid reality, each with its own mechanisms for maintaining identity, adapting, and ensuring survival through feedback.
And individual humans, too.
Wiener put it beautifully. He highlighted that our personal identity is maintained by homeostasis, by these continuous feedback processes. He said, "We are but whirlpools in a river of ever-flowing water. We are not stuff that abides, but patterns that perpetuate themselves. A pattern is a message and may be transmitted as a message."
Patterns that perpetuate themselves. That applies to us as individuals, but also to society as a collective pattern.
Exactly. Society itself is a vastly complex, self-regulating system, and if society is a system that can be influenced by messages and patterns, well, then there's significant potential for manipulation, isn't there?
Which brings us to what the sources call the exploitation algorithm, and this idea of RK selection applied to information. That sounds ominous.
It's a critical and, somewhat darker application of these ideas. The theory suggests that figures like Edward Bernays, often called the father of public relations or propaganda, and B.F. Skinner, with his work on operant conditioning.
Behaviorism, right. Rewards and punishments.
Right. They are seen within this framework as having discovered the levers of control in the societal substrate, the collective mind. They developed, essentially, technologies for manipulating the informational waves within the collective human mind.
How does this supposed exploitation algorithm work today?
The theory suggests modern societal control often operates by engineering an informational environment that deliberately prioritizes and amplifies what are termed R-selected informational strategies.
Selected. Like RK selection theory in ecology. Fast reproduction, low investment.
Exactly that analogy. These are messages, memes, narratives that are designed to be fast, simple, emotionally charged, low context. Think headlines, tweets, viral videos, things that spread rapidly and shallowly, reproducing quickly with minimal critical engagement.
So instead of thoughtful, nuanced, case-selected information.
Right. Things like books, scientific papers, depth investigative journalism, nuanced analysis that's case-selected information. Like case-selected species in ecology, it requires slowness, complexity, nuance, high context, and a low rate of reproduction. It takes time and effort to produce and consume.
And the right-selected stuff just overwhelms it.
That's the argument. This constant fire hose of Rye-selected information overwhelms the capacity for case-selected thought. It makes deep critical thinking, sustained attention, and nuanced understanding increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for many people caught in this stream.
And social media platforms play a big role here.
A huge role, according to this view. They act as a kind of global-scale Skinner box. The likes, shares, retweets, notifications, algorithmically curated feeds, these are all forms of variable ratio reinforcement schedules.
Like slot machines giving unpredictable rewards to keep you hooked.
Exactly. Creating powerful dopamine-driven addictive loops that are incredibly effective at propagating raw-selected information and shaping predictable patterns of belief and behavior on a mass scale. It optimizes for engagement and spread, not necessarily for truth or depth.
This sounds chillingly like a recipe for that behavioral sync phenomenon observed by John B. Calhoun in his mouse experiments.
It's a direct parallel drawn by the sources, yeah. Calhoun's Universe 25 experiment, the mouse utopia.
Where they had everything they needed but collapsed anyway.
Right. Despite ample resources, overpopulation, and the sheer density of social interactions led to a complete breakdown of complex social behaviors, a behavioral sink. Mice lost the capacity for mating, nest building, raising young. Essentially, the more complex behaviors compatible with species survival.
And the extrapolation to humans is
That a similarly engineered environment, one saturated with low-quality information, constant distraction, and addictive feedback loops, can potentially degrade human potential. There's a quote in the sources, sort of poetic. Maybe we should change our flow, but our flow is tight, though. The harmony thing seems old. Something don't smell right, yo.
capturing that feeling that something's wrong, but we're stuck in the current.
Yeah, it speaks to the reduction of variety, the rendering of complex, case-selected existence as somehow obsolete or too difficult. The sources argue that human potential is thereby degraded and debased and firmly sat on, leading to a state of constant crisis management, anxiety, and neurosis. People lose recollection of what stability means because the frantic rate at which the expanding world is operating is completely out of gear with our innate biological and psychological systems.
So society, or forces within it, are actively reducing our variety, limiting our potential states, often without us realizing it, just to make things more manageable or controllable.
That ties into Stafford Beer's cybernetic concept of variety, which is simply the number of possible states a system can be in. He observed that complex systems, like societies, tend to try and reduce your variety to something that is handleable by the social system at large.
Through laws, norms, conventions, economic pressures.
Exactly, making behavior more predictable and controllable. However, Beer also noted that what looks to the bosses, the controllers, as a necessary calming of variety is often perceived by the elements of the system, the individuals, as a gross interference with individual liberty.
Yeah, that tension is familiar.
So variety engineering becomes the crucial task from a cybernetics perspective, not reducing variety, but amplifying the variety of the system, the society, the individuals, to allow it to cope effectively with the complexity of its environment, giving people more meaningful options, more agency, more freedom to adapt and flourish.
And the will of the people fits in here.
It becomes this dynamic force, the expression of the system's inherent variety. It starts bubbling and boiling, as Beer put it, when its variety is attenuated too much, when freedoms are overly restricted.
But there's a danger too, right? With data collection.
A huge danger highlighted by Wiener and Beer. If we understand how they react, if systems can gather enough data to create detailed profiles of individuals and groups predicting their behavior, then that creates a massive vulnerability. Behavior can be predicted, nudged, controlled.
It enables a subtle, pervasive form of societal subjugation, potentially without people even realizing the extent to which their choices are being shaped. This is part of that profound dissonance. The theory points to the gap between the powerful mechanisms shaping our collective existence and our often limited awareness of them.
beyond the veil consciousness, death, and the afterlife. Okay, this brings us inevitably to some of the deepest, most profound questions of human existence. Questions that science traditionally, well, either avoids or labels as purely philosophical, maybe even taboo. How does PSMOT, with its universal superfluid information waves and observer shaping, how does it attempt to bridge that ultimate transition? The shift that happens to our minds between birth and death, and crucially, what might happen after death, this feels like maybe the most profound aspect of the whole framework.
It truly is, I think, because it suggests that consciousness viewed as this fundamental information wave might not actually be extinguished when the physical body dies.
Not extinguished.
That's the implication. But rather, it undergoes a profound transformation. And crucially, our individual beliefs, memories, our entire life's experience, the accumulated pattern of our information waves, plays an active role in shaping what we perceive during and perhaps after that transition.
So consciousness persists, and what we experience is linked to who we were.
That's the direction it points. And it draws on some pretty intense subjective experiences to make its case, doesn't it? Like the DMT experience, which often involves incredibly vivid, seemingly out-of-body journeys or encounters.
Yeah, the DMT decoupling protocol, as the sources term it. How does PSU motif frame that? Not just as a drug trip, presumably.
No, not just as a chemical side effect. It frames the DMT state as potentially a kind of rehearsal for the death transition, a glimpse into a similar process.
The rehearsal, how?
The idea is that during this state, the brain's normal filters those neural networks like the default mode network, DMN, that usually shape and limit our everyday perception, keeping us focused on survival and the mundane are temporarily suspended or bypassed.
So the usual reality filter goes offline.
Essentially. And in this less filtered state, the individual's information wave, their core consciousness pattern perhaps, as the sources speculatively suggest, carried or mediated by a burst of biophotons.
Biophotons. Light produced by living tissue.
Yeah, it's a speculative but intriguing idea. This information wave is then proposed to interact directly with a field of pure potential, the raw, undifferentiated superfluid substrate.
So consciousness, maybe using light as a carrier, temporarily decouples from the usual brain constraints and interfaces directly with the fundamental reality field, that is, mind expanding. It suggests a potential mechanism for consciousness to exist or transition independently of the brain, at least temporarily.
It's a radical proposal, absolutely. And what's important here is that this perspective elevates subjective experience. It treats first-person accounts of these profound states, DMT experiences, near-death experiences, NDEs, not as inherently unreliable anecdotes or mere hallucinations to be dismissed.
Which is often the standard scientific approach.
Right. But instead, it treats them as potentially valid, crucial data points for scientific inquiry, if they can be analyzed within a coherent theoretical framework like PSUOT. It takes phenomenology, the careful study of subjective experience, seriously.
And this observer shaping idea we talked about earlier, our beliefs and internal state shaping our perceived reality, becomes absolutely critical in these liminal states, doesn't it?
Hugely critical.
Yeah.
Because the reality that emerges from this interaction during an NDE or DMT state, according to PSU, isn't some fixed universal afterlife that's identical for everyone. There's no single heaven or hell blueprint.
So what is it then?
It's described as a co-creation, a personalized reality dynamically generated.
Yeah.
It's uniquely shaped by the observer's own deepest beliefs, memories, and archetypal structures, the very patterns that constitute their individual information wave.
So consciousness isn't just passively watching a movie after death, it's actively helping direct the movie.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
This participatory aspect aligns perfectly with the core PSEMO concept that our internal world continuously generates its own subjective reality. In these profound, less filtered states, that subjective reality generation takes on a new, direct interaction with the universal field of potential.
And Jung's ideas fit here too, the archetypes.
They could offer a powerful psychological interpretation. Those profound, often numinous experiences reported in NDEs, the encounters with beings of light, life reviews, the feeling of cosmic unity. These might be understood as the individual's consciousness encountering those deep, universal, archetypal patterns of information held within the collective unconscious, or the PSS itself. It's the personal meeting the universal.
So our individual internal landscape, our life's accumulated information, beliefs, traumas, joys, literally contributes to shaping the experience of death or these profound altered states. It makes death potentially a truly individual co-created journey based on the information we are.
That's the profound implication. But, when we talk about death, humans seem almost unique in their intense fear of it, yet nature itself seems to have found ways around mortality in some species, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's a fascinating contrast. While we humans instinctively, existentially, and narratively grapple with death, nature offers these incredible examples of biological immortality, or at least extreme longevity.
Right. Like the hydra, that tiny freshwater polyp. It exhibits seemingly infinite self-renewal thanks to a specific gene regulator called FOXO. It can literally regenerate its entire body from just a small fragment. It doesn't seem to age.
Amazing. And there are others too.
Oh yeah. Greenland sharks can live for 400, maybe 500 years.
Yeah.
Certain jellyfish, the immortal jellyfish, can actually reverse their aging process under stress, reverting back to an earlier developmental stage and starting over. They show negligible senescence, or even negative senescence.
So these natural examples highlight that longevity, self-renewal, escaping aging it is biologically possible for living systems. But for humans, given our current puny human lifespan, as the sources put it, the focus inevitably shifts to the fate of consciousness itself, right?
Precisely. The big question for us isn't just about extending physical life indefinitely, but about what happens to the pattern, the information, the consciousness that constitutes us when the biological hardware inevitably fails.
And that brings us back to epigenetics too, maybe, as a kind of information persistence.
It ties in, yeah. Remember how epigenetics suggests a kind of biological memory that transcends individual cellular death, allowing significant memories, maybe even traumas, to be physically embedded in the DNA structure and potentially passed down?
Right, a continuity of information across generations.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
even at a purely biological level, there's a hint of this continuity of information, a form of memory or pattern persistence that extends beyond the individual organism in a profound way. It hints at these persistent patterns.
Which PSU mode then expands to a cosmic scale, suggesting consciousness itself is such a persistent pattern within the universal superfluid.
That's the ultimate unifying leap the theory makes, connecting the biological microcosm to the cosmic macrocosm.
Outro. So wow, we've journeyed from the cosmic superfluid as the potential bedrock of reality, aiming to explain mysteries like dark matter and dark energy with a kind of elegant simplicity all the way to the intricate dance of our individual minds, maybe actively shaping our perception through belief and expectation.
And even touched upon that most profound transition of death, suggesting consciousness might persist and co-create its experience based on its own information patterns.
It's a theory that really challenges, explains, and tries to unify in ways that, as we discussed, mainstream science is still grappling with, often because of its maybe inherent reductionist and hyper-specialized approach.
It really does push us to reconsider the very nature of observation, even language itself. The idea that our frameworks, the questions we ask, our interactions, they aren't just passively describing reality, but might be actively influencing it.
Not just socially, like we saw with the cybernetics of control and the exploitation algorithm.
But perhaps even at a fundamental quantum level through this concept of observer shaping. That wall between the physical and the metaphysical, the observer and the observed, really starts to dissolve in this picture, revealing what might be a deeply interconnected participatory reality.
Okay, and here's where it gets really thought-provoking for you, our listener. Think about this. If our deepest beliefs, our ingrained memories, our core archetypal patterns can potentially actively co-create the reality we experience in those extreme liminal states like near-death experiences or DMT floods,
If that's even partially true.
what does that imply about the reality that we are all, collectively and individually, shaping right here, right now in our everyday lives, through our assumptions, our focus, our shared narratives?
It raises such an important question. How might a deeper understanding of these processes, this continuous observer shaping, this potential universal memory, this idea of fundamental proto-consciousness, if they are indeed real and operating all the time, how might that change how we approach living?
Yeah, how would it change our understanding of our own mind, our responsibility for our perceptions, our personal narratives?
And ultimately, perhaps, how we approach that universal transition, that mystery of death that awaits every single one of us. Does it change fear into curiosity, maybe?
An incredibly ambitious scope, that's for sure, and a truly profound deep dive today into the very fabric of consciousness and reality itself. We definitely invite you to keep pondering this intricate, maybe inseparable dance between biology, physics, information, and the enduring mysteries of the mind long after our conversation ends.